Hi, welcome to my Poppy Appeal 2020 video. This is a short time-lapse video of me drawing my contribution for this year. If you are watching this in 2020, near the 11th of November, you can find details below for how you can enter the Poppy Appeal raffle, where this drawing, along with a few other flower drawings, are available to win through a raffle. All proceeds will be going to the 2020 Poppy Appeal. So what I'm doing at the minute is just putting in my darks, my darkest darks. You either want to start with your lightest lights or your darkest darks, generally speaking. This is a general rule, and obviously sometimes I will start with something completely different. Generally speaking, with a mammal, I would start with the eye, for example. But when you're working on something all over, and with a flower like this, I will work on the whole thing at once. I'll pick one of my dominant tones to begin with, and then you get a really good structure straight away, which is very useful. So I'm putting in the darks right now, and I'm just making sure that I've got some soft edges around these blocks of shading. And I'm now going in with the red. So what I'm doing is I'm going around these shadows that I've just blocked in and putting this punchy red in, which is going to fill in the rest of the poppy. So that means I've got a base to work into for all of the poppy now. All of the poppy will have pastel down, and if you've got pastel down, then you can mix into it, and then you can get really beautiful soft transitions, which for something like a flower, when the petals are almost silky, they're so delicate on poppies, you really do want to be able to get some soft transitions, as well as having some good structure in there. So the structure has been provided by putting in the shadows first. And what I'm doing now is I'm going in with a sort of mediator pencil, you could call it, and I'm fussing the edges between the shadow and that mid-tone, that really bright red. As much as the red is very intense in its colour, it's not very light. It's probably about a tone 5. It's not too bright. So we want to put in quite a lot more light later on with our highlights. So at the minute, I'm just joining the flower together, and I'll go back in and add in the red for the rest of the petals in a moment. And as I'm doing this, I'm pressing nice and hard and really filling in the tooth of the card. If you don't fill it in, you'll end up with something that's really quite grainy and much darker, because of course we've chosen this dark blue board to draw on. So we really want to make sure that we've properly filled it in. So you can see how that softness is being created by blending the edges of that red into the dark shadow, that really deep magenta colour. So if we didn't do that, we would end up with something that's quite stiff and looks a bit like paint by numbers and doesn't really all seem to be part of the same thing. So I'm adding in my highlights now, but I'm not going straight in with something really obvious like a white. In fact, I don't use white on any of this drawing. I'm starting off with orange. So I'm taking the colour red and I'm looking at the colour wheel and I'm taking it around towards the orange side of things and warming it up for the highlights. And the shadows are magenta. They're heading towards purple. So that's quite a nice little touch, is to use warm and cool in your drawings. And I started out with a corally sort of orange, and now I'm working in a much brighter orange. We're definitely into orange as a colour by itself now, and you can see how that's showing up really vibrant and fresh on top of the red that we've already put down. And because I filled in the tooth of the card properly, this is blending in really nicely, and it's all starting to become part of the same thing. It's all sitting on the same plane. So I'm now adding in some ivory. I'm using Pastel for this, and as you get brighter, you need to become more refined, more selective, and make these marks smaller. So if I was to use white on this drawing, for example, I would probably pick 1 or 2 areas to put it into and use a very, very small amount. If you look at photos, if you look just actually in life, at something in the sunlight, the whole thing isn't really bright and white. We've just got that speck, that highlight that is so bright you can't quite look at it. But for this drawing, it wasn't really appropriate to take it that bright, so I've kept white out of this. I'm now using some pink. These 2 petals, which I haven't really worked into very much yet, these aren't catching the light in a reflective quality, in a reflective way like the top and the bottom are. These, the light is passing through these petals and it's much softer. So to reflect that, I've used a pink, which obviously is red with some white mixed into it. And this is giving us a brighter area on the petals still, but it's much softer. So when I do add some lighter areas to those petals in a bit on the tips, it won't look too sharp. It won't be so shiny bright like the other petals are. So adding in the centre of the flower, this is the focal point of our whole drawing, because red and green must never be seen. They are complementary colours, they're opposites on a colour wheel, and they jar against each other. So by having them in such close proximity on one drawing, it's going to bring our eyes straight to the centre of the flower. It's a real centre of interest for us. So I'm making sure, once again, I'm really pressing hard and filling in the card to get this down. And now I'm just deepening the centre so that it's darker. We've got a little bit more depth. This isn't black though, it's not quite that dark. And I'm going to be bringing some dimension to this by bringing little spots around the green in the centre of the poppy, which these are coming out of the flower. And obviously petals are quite flat, they're quite two-dimensional. These I've tried to bring as much movement in as possible with all those swirling brush marks, pencil marks, sorry. But adding this bit in, this centre of interest, this really does come out from those petals. And that's really great to have in any drawing, is a sense of dimension. So I'll add in some highlights onto these almost black marks later on as well, so that they too are catching the light. So I'm just going to deepen up some of the shadows. You will see me when I work in all my tutorials, I'm working backwards and forwards constantly with all of the pencils, which is why it's quite difficult really to write step-by-steps, which you can find on my website, just because as I'm going along, I'll see something and I'll fix it, I'll change something, and that type of working method is something that you will develop with more practice. So starting off with step-by-steps is really great, but always remember you can break the rules. And if you see something on your drawing and you think, actually, I want to add a bit of red into that, a bit of pink into that, then go for it and see what happens. So now I'm fixing my edges. This is something that you should always do towards the end of any drawing, is go around and look at your edges. This is outer edges, so I'm working on the outer edges of a petal, but also your inside edges. And by that I mean where a shadow becomes a mid-tone or a mid-tone becomes a highlight. And you want to check that these edges are all working together really naturally. Some need to be very soft and some will be focal points, and they need to have sharp edges so you can see what's going on. It's going to grab your attention. So I can sometimes get to the end of a drawing and see that all of the edges are too sharp and there's nowhere for the eye to just rest, in which case I need to go in, decide where my focal point is, and then areas which aren't the focal point, which are supporting it, they need to become softer. And likewise, if I haven't got a focal point, then I need to go in and add some sharp edges. So now I'm adding the highlights in the center of the flower. It's bringing the eye once again back to the green, because these are lots more little specks of interest that are sat on top of something very dark, and they're just jumping out against it. So it's really important to have those supporting areas. And I'm going back around the petals now, just for the brightest edges, which help ground the flower. It's also worth noting that as you work, your brightest highlights, if you've done something like a mammal, for example, and you've put the eye in, they will dull as you draw, and you'll start to lose the vibrancy of the white, say, in the highlight. So you see that I'm adding, I keep adding bits of red, that bright red, because the more pastel I add onto the page, I lose that saturation and the vibrancy as I'm adding the much needed shadows and highlights, and you don't want to lose that completely. So it is worth the end of a drawing going back. If you've got areas of black that really need to be black, then just colour back over them again, because they'll have picked up a bit of pastel dust as you've worked, and likewise for white. I'm just adding in the stem now, which is the last bit of the drawing. We don't want this to be a very dominant part of the drawing, but it is, obviously it's very important, and it gives the poppy grounding into the painting. And I'm adding a lovely soft edge with a light grey there, because the poppies do have sort of furry stems to them, so it's worth adding that texture, and texture makes something really interesting to look at. And at the end of any drawing, take your putty rubber and clean around all of the edges and the card in general to make sure that there isn't lots of dust that's just sat on the drawing. See, there we go again, just punching up that red, making sure it's really bright and properly saturated, because at the end of the day, this is a red poppy. So thank you very much for watching. This is the finished poppy. As I said at the beginning, if you are watching this in November 2020, then do take a look at the links down below, because you might still be able to take part in the raffle draw for this drawing, but also for a couple of other botanical works that I've done this year. And all proceeds will be going to the Poppy Appeal. If you'd like to find out more about tutorials, then you can head over to my website at www.emilyrosefineart.co.uk, and you can also find links down below and on my website to social media. And you can also join up right now to my waiting list, because I'm releasing an online art school next year that's going to go live, and if you're on the waiting list, then you'll be the first to hear about it, and also get the option to become an early bird, get early access and an amazing deal too. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.